I am one, not a data scientist. In fact, I don't even know how to fly an airplane. The only thing I know about aviation data is the seat configuration of every single Boeing aircraft, because I've flown in almost all of those seats. I'm a space cadet. And the only reason I point out my dad is the fact that I've been doing nothing but space for a huge part of my life. I tried to defect by becoming a Sovietologist, and then of course ended up writing about space. So once it gets under your skin, you never can quite shake it. I got a question though. How many space cadets are there here? And the way I'll define that is if you spend more than 25% of your time thinking about or doing things related to space, then you're a space cadet. How many space cadets? 1, 2, really? 3, 4. I knew Robert. I knew I could count on Robert. 5, 4.5-ish. So this is awesome because I spend all of my time talking to space cadets about space. And that's a problem because we're really not going to grow the space ecosystem until we start talking to real people about the real economy. So this is really cool for me. So I said I'm not going to talk about data. What I am going to talk about, though, are the really big questions we're facing with space. Where is my, do I have a clicker here? I'm just going to have to do this then. All right. What I want to talk about, there are really big questions facing us in space. In fact, this is going to work? Cool. Yeah, you can see I can't stay in one place. I have never known of a time in the history of space, with the possible exception of maybe in the late 50s, just before the Soviet Union blew our socks off, right? Where was more uncertainty. If you look at any segment of the space ecosystem, we talk about it like we know what's going on, but we don't. And we've got a ton of data out there that we're not really using to understand what the future is. So with this uncertainty, there's a certain amount of danger. And what I'm going to do is spend most of my time in this talk talking about big questions. And these are big questions. Is the commercial sector going to take over? How many people think it is? How many people think it has already taken over? Ha! No, it hasn't. You'll see when I get to it. You'll see when I get to it. Because we're not looking at the data. We're looking at newspaper articles. All right, so that second big question, will low Earth orbit remain sustainable? We know this one. And we know this is a big data problem. We know lots of people are looking at it. So that's something that we kind of know, but we honestly, we don't know how to fix the debris problem. We know how to do it technically. We do not have a clue how to do it politically or economically. And I don't know that we're going to figure that out here today, but it's a big question. And it is really a big data question. The third one has an element of it, which is a big data question, which is, are we going to have conflict in space? We know we're going to have competition with China. I mean, that horse has left the barn, so to speak. And it's not anyone's fault. This is just the balance of power in the global system. It's a natural evolution. Anyway, big questions. So let's start with commercial space. So really good things are happening. We've got the 2 richest people in the world supporting space, and not just supporting space financially, but supporting space psychologically. These 2 guys are committed to space. We had Bill Gates committed to space back in the late 90s with a company called Teledesic that we were going to darken the satellite with 800 satellites. Could you imagine 800 satellites? Right, Elon launches that about every month. But Bill Gates didn't really care. He bailed pretty quickly. Bezos, I think, is even more invested. I think he's funding it with his own money, not other people's money. Do you realize that between these 2 guys, they have more money than the GDP of Denmark? Actually, the space economy has higher sales, depending on how you look at it, and we'll get to that, than Denmark. So these are good things. One of the best things, and if you look back at what we had the last crash, this was a talk I gave yesterday about waves crashing. We want to go, that's good. All right, about waves crashing, and this is actually the third wave of space commercialization. The last one crashed because we were dependent on a single industry, a single market, and in many ways, a single company. So what you see going on right now looks good. We've got 389 companies in Earth observation. SATCOM, we may have as much as 58,000 satellites. It's a problem. That's not necessarily a good thing. Space transportation, $35 billion, 144 companies. That's great, except the market will support about 5, but the point is there's a lot of stuff going on, even lunar development. We've got private investment in these areas. Over $298 billion of equity investment. You all are data scientists. Is something missing here? Do the numbers add up? No, they do not, because almost $200 billion of that investment is right here. GPS apps. That's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing. And it's something you need to understand. And this isn't digging deeply into the data. It's just something you need to understand about space. You know, literally, Apple probably controls half of space if you want to get down to it. They may have the biggest stake in space through their App Store. So that's just something to know. So, large amounts of money are being invested in space. This is Major Tom. That is not my dad, that's Major Tom. Won't get into the stories about Major Tom and my dad, but he'll appear throughout the presentation. Major Tom is great because he doesn't speak much, but he thinks good questions. So what could possibly go wrong here? So this is a data set from Space Capital. It's a wonderful database on investment in companies, really interactive. You can play around with it and have all kinds of fun. I can have all kinds of fun. I don't know if normal people would have fun with this kind of stuff. What could possibly go wrong? Well, that's not so good. Investment has dropped off of a cliff. And it's not just space, to be fair, but it is a tough time to get investment in space right now. Let's look at something else that could go wrong. Do I have Richard? I don't have Richard in this one. Okay, so we all know about new companies coming into space. Everybody's making tons of money. Well, there are signs of trouble. So this is actually Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson's company, that if you look back, is there a pointer on this? What? Oh, I got it. Except it moves. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, I see. That's cool. All right, so Virgin Galactic, at one point, they've got stock worth $57 a share, and then it collapsed, and now it's down around $1.50 a share, 84% loss. This is over the whole time period, I think, yeah. Now let's look at some companies that I think these are some of the best managed companies in the new space environment. This is a company called Spire. They do a really good job of they float some of their own satellites, but they do a really great job of actually using other people's data to do all kinds of things. They actually use radio occultation to contribute to weather forecasting. Cool stuff, but look, they're down 84%. This is everybody's darling, AST Space Mobile. These are the guys that are going to float satellites, orbit satellites, that are going to send signal down to your device, which I've heard telecom executives describe as a signal attenuation device. And everybody's going to have cellular connectivity, broadband connectivity everywhere. There's a kind of a problem that it actually doesn't work. I mean, you can get text messaging, and maybe you'll get to kilobytes of data. That's kind of a problem, and the market is catching up, but they've been a darling at various times. You see these little bumps, but they're down 70%. And this is one of the better companies, Rocket Lab. I actually like Rocket Lab. Ironically, back when their stock was at, where do we do this? This is not so intuitive. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I don't like this thing so much. Back when their stock was at $20 a share, I thought the company was a disaster because they were in the small launch market. And remember, you got 100 companies in the small launch market, a market which will support 3. We actually did an analysis of this. I thought that was a disaster. The good news is they've moved on and they're doing a lot of different things. They're doing bigger launchers, they're doing satellites, lots of good stuff happening there, but they are still down, what, 59%. So there are real questions. What's going to happen here? And I think what's likely is there's going to be a shakeout, and we care, as a matter of national policy, what comes out of this. And we don't have a clue. We have a ton of data, but we're not doing anything with the tools we have to predict what's going on with that. Now let's get to what is the size of the space economy. So it's big, right? We should all agree on what the size of the space economy is, right? We don't. So the Bureau, where am I starting with this on? Bureau of Economic Analysis, which has just stood up in office, actually just looks at the US, and they've come up with the lower number. The Space Foundation, which has been doing this for a lot longer, comes up with a much bigger number. And the people we can all trust, Morgan Stanley, come up with a much bigger number. So Major Tom says, who's telling the truth here? They're all telling the truth. Nobody's making stuff up. They're just counting things differently. We'll get into some of that. The Bureau of Economic Analysis looks at the US only, and they take a fairly careful look at the stuff which uses space but may not be space dependent as being part of the economy. Space Foundation probably double counts. One of the problems is when you dig into this and start asking the people who did the analysis where the data came from, they don't know. There's this notion somehow or another, particularly, I know this is in the Morgan Stanley numbers, I think it's actually I know it's in the Space Foundation numbers, that $100 billion a year of the space market are GPS chips. You go out and look, we sell about 1 billion cell phones a year, or smartphones a year. The chips are about $10. Retail, I can buy the chips for $10. So that gets me to 10 billion. Where is the other 90 billion? I don't know. They don't know. Somewhere, sometime, back in the history of data generation, somebody came up with a number, and you got to take it takes a crowbar to get that number out of people. So they're data problems too. Interestingly, oh, hang on, I got to go back. I didn't. Bureau of Economic Analysis actually just got done with their meeting of statisticians. And first of all, they can't agree on what's space and what's not space. But they did agree that the space economy actually contracted this year in real terms, adjusted for inflation. So maybe it's not all rosy, but for sure it's important. So let's look at the $1 trillion space economy. Oh, hang on, I didn't want you here yet. The $1 trillion space economy. This is the Morgan Stanley numbers. I use Morgan Stanley numbers not because I'm in love with them, but it's the only data set that actually goes out to 2040. But look at all of this stuff. You've got this black thing is called second order impacts. What's a second order impact? Is this 7-Eleven next to Kennedy Space Center part of the space economy? Well, you could argue that, right? If what you want to know is what's the economic impact on the overall economy of space? Yeah, I want to know about that. If what you want to know is what are the drivers behind the space economy, you don't really want to know about that. So Major Tom comes in and says, is this stuff really space? Second order impacts. And you've also got non-satellite industry, which I don't know what it is. So there's lots of questions here. This is kind of where I end up with as being the total adjusted space economy. I left the non-satellite industry in there because I am hoping that when you dig inside these numbers, what it's going to tell you is these are the machine shops that are building space hardware or stuff like that. That would make sense. But still, it's not a really great way to look at things. 4% overall growth. This is the way I like looking at the space economy. This first orbit, if you will, around Earth is the part of the economy that actually builds stuff. They build launch vehicles, they build satellites, they build stuff that flies in space. They actually build a lot of the ground equipment too. But look at this. Let's see. Okay, look at the bottom. Commercial satellite manufacturing, $21 billion. These are 2031 numbers. And I've actually, I've kind of done some things to adjust to make the numbers a little bit clearer. $21 billion, but you look at government space systems, it's $198 billion. Okay, let's go back to the question. Is space commercialized? Actually, this is an even split. At least half of that is the US alone. Big chunk of it is the national security side of it. Launch services are only $10 billion. I point that one out just because people think launch is a big deal. It is. You need launch to get up there, but it's not a big part of the space economy. Let's go to the second orbit. This is ground equipment. This is the GPS chips. It's also the Starlink terminals, which are kind of a big deal. But it's interesting because if you look at the economics of it, this looks like the computer industry, this looks like the aerospace industry. Now here's where you get to the interesting stuff. The users of space data that actually pay for it. They pay for the satellites. So this is mostly comm, but it's split into two groups. Sorry, you notice this is growth rate, and the size of the market is the size of the balloon. And so the biggest chunk is SATCOM, 141 billion, but it's very low growth. But look at broadband, $50 billion, but we're looking at, the estimates are, and we'll see if I disabuse you of this notion as well, the estimates are that that's about 15% growth. So that's where you want to be. What could possibly go wrong? I've mentioned before that I like geospatial. It's not a big market now. It probably will never be that huge, but I like the growth, and I actually like the fact that you can't do that stuff from the ground. What you need for geospatial information, sure, you can have a bunch of drones and stuff like that, but you fundamentally need space. You actually don't need space for telecom. Let's talk about that. Oh, actually, I've got to go. Here are the freeloaders, right? $482 billion and 31 GPS space. So just when you see people throwing around $1 trillion economy things, and I admit, I've done it. When I'm playing space advocate, I talk about a $1 trillion economy, but you all know better now. Okay, let's talk about telecom. So the thing is, space is just a small and frankly low-performing and unprofitable part of the telecom economy. But if you step back and look at the forest, right? Space is just a tree in the forest. That forest is not a pleasant place to be. Margins in telecom pretty much suck. Growth sucks. Well, how could that be, right? The need for data because of all of you guys in AI is exploding. The problem is the price people will pay is imploding at about the same rate. Space data has gone down 25% in the last 3 years, the price for space data. That was actually driven by SpaceX. It's not a wonderful market to live in, I don't think. Here's the broadband prices. From 19 to 25, they've gone down from $40 a megabit per month to 15. The good news is it doesn't have much further down to go, does it? So let's get into some of the stuff about space telecom. Can I do this? All right, so in this concentric circle right there, you've got urban. And can space at, let's say, Starlink does 100 megabits a second on a really, really good day. And maybe it gets better, but it's never going to get to the point where it's delivering 10 to 20 gigabits a second. And you're going to be able to do this over 5G millimeter wave in urban areas. You're not going to get that kind of bandwidth in suburban areas, but still, I live about 20 miles outside of Denver in I'll call it, it's suburban, but semi-rural. The deer's coming to eat our flowers. We got beavers making a dam outside our house. I get 500 megabits a second in my office, in the basement, which are really the first floor, 20 miles from Denver. Why on earth would I need Starlink? The only place where you need Starlink is the rural areas. People that are unconnected. What? Oh, okay. Do you have Starlink? No. So you don't need Starlink because, okay. Where Starlink really, really, really makes sense is the mobile market. Maritime, aircraft. I just quick back of the postage stamp numbers in the aircraft industry based on what data some of my students gave me. Aren't they great research assistants? You just give them the right assignment and they give you data to want. So that's probably $1 billion, $1.5 billion a year market, which isn't bad, except that SpaceX has got $100 to $150 billion constellation. It's tough. I don't know if you're going to get there. So let's keep going. This is the market for space-based broadband. It's basically people that are unconnected. Cisco data, unconnected markets. It's kind of hard to read, but all those numbers are negative. You can see that. Where it's not negative, right here, the green, that's the Middle East and Africa. And the reason that's not negative is they can't really pay for what's out there right now, and so paying for an expensive broadband system in space is going to be tough. And so I think you're kind of limited to this little thing here over time. But that's still $70 billion in 2040. It's not bad. Why is this shrinking? Well, it's shrinking for two reasons. One, we've already talked about, the price for data going down. The other reason is obviously as people get connected, they are no longer not connected, so they're not part of your market. So, this seems like a good time for Major Tom to show up. Can that market support a $200 billion investment? Because if you wrap up all the SATCOM networks, constellations that people are talking about, it's not hard to get to $200 billion. And I actually haven't done the math to figure out what kind of income you would have to have and margins to make that work, but it's a big number. It's a big number. And I'm not saying it's not gonna happen, because Elon has proved me wrong every single time. But I'm still in the batter's box, I don't know. I just want you to understand, this is a tough question. And we need to understand what the real market is for all of this stuff if we want to understand what's going to happen with it. Am I running out of time already? No, I'm not. I'm good. I'm good. Okay, so let's talk about the big gorilla in the room, space debris. You got all of these satellites up there in this constellation. That starts to create a problem for space debris, right? And so the launch rates are increasing pretty massively. Oh, I didn't want to go to that one yet. Pretty massively, and it's contributing to this, which is the cumulative number of objects in space that are 10 centimeters or larger. These are basically CubeSats and anything bigger. So this is big stuff that can cause really big problems. Actually, stuff this big, traveling, at a closing velocity of, 35,000 miles an hour, can be ugly in itself. But if you look at the top number, where we are right now is 30,000 of these objects. There are proposals for systems which would raise that by 58,000 to 90,000. Okay, so this is an issue. Now, the truth is, we can fairly easily peel off that 58,000 down to about 20,000 if you had just start looking at it. But the point is, we got to kind of understand what's real. And this is a huge data problem, but I think there are people like Mariba Jha that are working on it, that have really good data science behind what they're doing. And that's good. But like I said, this isn't a technical problem. This is an economic and a political problem. I do have something that, sorry about that, Major Tom, that actually gets a little bit at the economics of debris. Because I just wanted to figure out what does it cost to manage the debris problem? And so this is kind of a straight line that came from a paper that some German people wrote. Basic data that satellites move around. Do I actually have? I don't think I did. The satellites make about 10 avoidance movements a year, and they use about 7 kilometers a second of delta V to do that. And so depending on the size of the satellite, you can estimate the amount of fuel consumption, and you can take that and turn that into cost to get that fuel into space. Real simple, back of the postage stamp kind of stuff. And so what you get to is if you've got a 40,000 satellite constellation at 2,000 kilograms, which is what I thought SpaceX was headed toward, but I think it's not. So that number is probably a little inflated. But still, you're looking at $1.5 billion of cost to do avoidance maneuvers. Now, what happens if you have to move more quickly? Because this assumption is that you have lots of lead time. This assumes you have less lead time, so you actually have to burn more fuel. And now you go up to almost $3 billion. And if you get more congested, you go up to $5 billion. Now, what does this mean? It means maybe you load a little bit more fuel, or you deorbit your satellites, whatever. It's just trying to attach some kind of economic value to this, because I don't think in spite of what everyone is doing in this area, I think we really need to kind of start working on what is the economic incentive for someone to deorbit fuel. Because if you actually look at taking a satellite out of orbit, it's crazy. It costs you about $4 million to take a satellite out of orbit, just looking at the fuel cost. So that's not a winning proposition. Okay, so we've got lots of satellites in space. This led me, at least personally, I'm going to try and torture you to follow my logic, to the deterrence problem in space. We have a deterrence problem in space, and it's a big deal potentially. And I think Robert understands it really well. If he doesn't, I will be surprised. The United States is the only global superpower. It is completely and totally dependent on space systems to maintain that global superpower. Russia, China, India, and probably other countries, North Korea, have the ability to destroy our satellites. Don't get me started on the Russian nuke thing. Well, you can, but only in the Q&A part. A first strike on US satellites would be, I won't say totally debilitating, but it's a real problem. And war games going back 10 years, the first thing that anyone does is start blowing up our satellites. It's a real problem. So what that means is that other countries have an incentive to strike US satellites. It's called first strike instability. And because I grew up, when I was at RAND, this first strike instability stuff is what I lived with. And then it occurred to me, we're doing this in space. The good news is I think we understand it, or if we don't understand it, we're doing the right things, because we're doing things to reduce it. But if you look at the number of targets we've got, it's massively larger than anyone else. You look at the number of military satellites, it's massively larger. So deterrence is fundamentally a numbers problem. You want to get to a situation in which neither side has a first strike advantage. Game theory, Tom Schelling stuff, this is what I learned in grad school. And it's worth revisiting that. And I think it's worth revisiting that with the kind of data analytic tools that we have today. And I don't see anyone doing that. If there is, no, even Moriba Jah is not looking at military aspects of this. So it's an important question. Okay, but if there's going to be conflict in space, this is where it's going to happen. My homeland, no. This is the moon. The thing about the moon is, all the moon is not equal. There are large parts of the moon that are incredibly valuable. These are the sections which are sitting on the edge of or very near craters that have permanently shaded regions. Permanently shaded regions have ice, we think. Ice is rocket fuel, and so that may be worth a lot. We're not really sure. The other thing about permanently shaded regions, particularly if you're on the pole and you're sitting on the edge of a crater which is elevated, is you have permanent sunlight, which is power. Lunar nights are horrible. If we had more lunar landers that actually landed, we would know this better. But it's incredibly cold. The thermodynamics of that are horrible. Interestingly, though, some of the spacecraft that actually did land on the moon and still were alive managed to survive. But you'd really rather be in a more isothermal environment sitting on the edge. So the point is, there are parts of the moon that are incredibly valuable, and so I looked for the most valuable real estate I could find in the world. This is a parking garage in Hong Kong. It sold for $1 million a square meter for a parking garage. I suspect they're going to build something else out of it, and then the rest of the moon looks like the Mojave Desert. And I actually did price real estate in the Mojave Desert, 35 cents a square meter. The point is, these areas that are really valuable are high-priced real estate. That's where you want to live. So one of the challenges is, this is one of the best, this is sort of like, this is Santa Monica in California, or Pacific Palisades, or maybe it's Miami Beach. I don't know. It's great real estate. You want to be on the edge of the Shackleton crater. This is dead at the South Pole. Cool place. So you can see the craters. So everyone wants to go there. I still think the US will get there first. China will probably get there second. I don't know. I have friends who honestly believe India will beat us. I don't see it happen. In fact, I don't really think they'll beat the Russians or the Japanese. The Russians, of course, will bounce their way to the moon. Point is, you've got lots of countries. With one exception, these countries all have one thing. They have nuclear weapons. They have big armies. This is a challenge. What makes it worse is you see all of these guys sort of wound around one crater. Surely we can just land on the same crater. We just get along. Well, there's a problem with that. When you land on the moon, the effects of the rocket plume on the regolith are pretty devastating. It spews out rocks because it doesn't have an atmosphere, it doesn't have much gravity for hundreds of kilometers. In fact, we think some of these rocks will go orbital. So why do we care about this stuff? What it means is, first one to land and put people on the moon are going to have a legitimate claim of a safety keep-out zone. Because forget about treaties. Not that Robert, I would never say forget about treaties, but these are the facts on the ground that matter. At some point, we will build treaties that will fill in around this. The point is, remember all our craters. There weren't a lot of them. once one country lands on that crater, they probably have a legitimate argument to say, nobody else lands on this without our approval. It may not work out that way, but I think I'm 2 minutes over, okay. I'm actually close to being done here. So one of the things we don't know about the moon, I'll go through this quickly because it actually isn't that much of a data problem. It's I don't know, kind of interesting. It's basically a transportation problem if you can get fuel from the moon and actually use it in low Earth orbit. So it takes you $2,000 a kilogram, best case, using a Starship to get a kilogram into low Earth orbit. So we know that's anything that you're going to do from the moon has to be less than $2,000 a kilogram. So it takes you about if you wanted to go to a fuel depot in Earth, Moon, L1, sort of balancing gravity of the Earth and the moon. It's a good place to sort of not rendezvous, but connect up. It's $6,000 a kilogram. It's $13,000 a kilogram to get anything to the moon. So let's look at what it takes if you've got a kilogram of stuff on the moon to get back to low Earth orbit. It's $1,500 a kilogram. So that's almost as much as it costs to actually send a kilogram, the transportation cost to get into low Earth orbit. So you've got to be able to produce a kilogram of propellant on the moon for less than $500. We don't know what it's going to cost, but this is not massively wrong. It's probably wrong by 10% one way or another, but I'm actually using Starship costs. And we don't know what's going to happen with Starship. That's actually another question. Anyway. Okay, so that's actually what does make sense is lunar propellant to go to Mars. That makes absolute sense. To actually change the way we do transportation in Earth orbit, I don't know. It does actually make sense probably to take stuff that you build on the moon to geosynchronous orbit if you can do like solar power satellites or something like that, but I digress. Okay. So, this is my one chart on data. We're working with a company called Quilty Space, and Quilty Space has built a pretty elegant database which incorporates a very inelegant database from Jonathan McDowell, who puts together a tremendous amount of data of every satellite that has ever been launched, virtually everything you can find on that stuff. Quilty has put this together into a really nice database. So we've got a good package of data looking backward. The question is, what can we do with that data to look forward? So closing thoughts is, everything is uncertain in space. And we can't, given where we are right now, we can't predict what the long-term outcomes are. But we've got the data to do something about it. We have the tools. The key to this whole thing, again, is Major Tom. We got to ask the right questions. And we're not going to come up with straight line projections. What I think we can do is, there are two futures forecasting tools that I think would be greatly enhanced by the use of artificial intelligence. One is scenario planning, the other is assumption-based planning. I like assumption-based planning because what it does is say, what are the things that really matter, that will cause inflection points? And I think we have the data that we can and the tools that we need to use to actually generate visions of the future, which will not so much tell us what the future is, but will tell us what's important to determining the future. And you can project the future based on some set of assumptions about things like what happens if Starship works, what happens if it doesn't work, those kinds of things. Anyway, folks, that concludes my presentation.